Vampire King told her she was replaceable. When he found her again, she looked right through him. Inside, the air smelled of old stone and secrets, and shadows moved like living things. This was the kingdom of Alaric, the Vampire King, ruler of a cursed realm where the night never ended. His eyes, dark as obsidian, had seen centuries pass, but one memory lingered above all: a human girl named Seraphine. Years ago, she had entered his life like a flame. Her laughter had been bright in the cold halls of his castle, her courage fierce even in the face of danger. But Alaric had been cruelly honest. She was replaceable, and so he let her go. She disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a hollow echo that he refused to name. For centuries he tried to forget her, but the memory returned in dreams, soft, piercing, impossible to escape. Now Seraphine walked the forests at the edge of his domain. The wind whispered through skeletal trees, and the moonlight touched her hair like silver fire. She had grown into a woman of quiet power, her eyes clear and unafraid. She moved with care, every step deliberate, as though the world might be both enemy and friend. Though she had once trembled before the Vampire King, that fear was gone. She had learned to survive, and more than that, to see clearly. The night was heavy with scent and shadow when Alaric sensed her. He had felt it before, an old, familiar pulse, but now it was stronger, sharper. His instincts, honed over centuries, told him that this was no ordinary human. It was her. She had returned. He found her at the edge of the forest, where the trees grew thin, revealing cliffs that fell into the dark waters below. She was standing alone, looking out over the churning sea, her hair tossing in the wind. Alaric's heart, if one could call it that after centuries of darkness, stuttered. He had imagined this moment for hundreds of years, yet now that she was here, it was nothing like he expected. She turned at the sound of his movement, her gaze steady and unyielding. "I wondered if you would ever come," she said, her voice calm, but her eyes burning with something he could not name. It was neither fear nor anger. It was recognition, understanding, and a kind of challenge. Alaric stepped closer, the moonlight catching the sharp angles of his face. He had expected fear, surprise, maybe even a plea for mercy. But she looked right through him, as if seeing not a king, not a monster, but a man who had once been human enough to make mistakes. "Seraphine," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant, "I did not think you would return." "I have never been gone," she replied. Her words were simple, but they cut deeper than any sword. "You may have thought me replaceable, but I was always here." The wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of the sea and the whisper of the forest. For the first time, Alaric felt uncertain, a fragile unease he had not known in centuries. How could this human, once so small and fragile, stand before him with such unwavering strength? "Why have you come?" he asked, trying to regain the control he had always wielded. Kings, even vampire kings, were masters of their realms. They commanded fear, loyalty, and obedience. But here, in this moment, he realized how powerless he felt. "To see the truth," she said, her gaze not leaving his, "and to remind you that some things cannot be replaced, no matter how much you think they can." Alaric's jaw tightened. The memory of her laughter, her small hands trembling in his, her whispered questions in the night, all of it pressed against the walls he had built around his heart. He had thought letting her go would ease the weight of immortality, but instead it had left a wound that never healed. They circled each other like predators in a slow, silent dance. Every step, every glance carried the weight of the past. Seraphine did not fear him, and that made him both uneasy and curious. He had ruled for centuries, yet no one had ever looked at him this way. Not with the clarity, not with the understanding, not with the fire that burned in her eyes now. "You changed," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "You think time makes monsters, but it only teaches them how to hide." Alaric flinched at the truth of her words. She had always seen him more clearly than anyone, and now that she stood before him it was unbearable. He wanted to deny it, to assert his dominance, to remind her of his power, but he could not. Her gaze was too strong, too unyielding. "Perhaps," he said finally, his voice rough, "but even monsters can remember what they have lost." A silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of waves smashing against the cliffs. Seraphine studied him, noting the weariness beneath the mask of immortal authority, the shadows that lingered in his eyes. She realized that the king she had feared, and the man who had dismissed her, was not the same as the one before her. Time had tempered his cruelty with something like regret. "You are not as invincible as you believe," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of command. "And I am not as fragile as you thought." Alaric's chest tightened. He had ruled through fear, through strength, through the weight of centuries. And yet here was a human, once powerless, reminding him that some things, some people, could not be controlled, could not be bent, could not be replaced. The wind rose suddenly, carrying the scent of smoke and salt, and in the distance a howl echoed through the cliffs. Alaric's instincts sharpened. Danger was near, something older and darker than the usual threats to his kingdom. Yet his attention did not stray from Seraphine. She had returned not just to haunt him with memories, but to confront him with the truth he had long denied. "You are in my lands," he said, trying to reclaim some of his old authority, "and yet you speak as if you are free." "I am free," she said simply. "And you will have to learn to accept that." Her words struck him like a blade. Freedom, the one thing he had never understood, the one thing he had never possessed in a world of shadows and curses. She was reminding him of a truth he had buried deep. Power is meaningless without respect, without choice, without the hearts of those you claim to rule. For a long moment they simply watched each other. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the cliffs, the dark waters below, and the faces of a vampire king and the woman he once believed replaceable. In that flash, centuries of silence and misunderstanding seemed to collapse into a single heartbeat. Then, without warning, Seraphine turned, walking slowly toward the edge of the forest. Alaric felt the familiar pull, the ancient need to follow, to command, to possess, but he did not move. For the first time in centuries, he realized that desire alone could not bind her. She was not a memory, not a prize, not a shadow of the past. She was real, alive, and unbroken. "You cannot chase me," she said over her shoulder, her voice carrying in the wind. "Not until you understand who I am and who you have become." Alaric's hands clenched at his sides. The centuries of solitude, the power, the fear he had wielded, all of it was nothing against the force of her gaze, the truth she carried. He had let her go once, believing her replaceable. Now, facing her again, he knew he had been wrong. And yet the memory of that past mistake gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. He could not simply claim her again. She would never allow it. He had to earn her trust, her respect, her recognition. For the first time he realized that love, if this could even be called that, was not something to be taken. It was something to be proved through courage, patience, and perhaps redemption. As Seraphine disappeared into the shadows of the forest, Alaric remained at the cliff's edge, staring into the darkness. The storm raged around him, but it was nothing compared to the storm within. A memory, a regret, a longing centuries in the making had returned to him in human form. He whispered her name, almost afraid it would vanish into the wind. "Seraphine!" The forest swallowed her figure, leaving only the echo of her presence. And for the first time in countless years, the vampire king felt uncertain, vulnerable, and achingly alive. He knew one thing with absolute clarity: she was not replaceable. And if he wanted to keep her, if he even deserved to, he would have to face the shadows of his own heart, the curse upon his kingdom, and the truth he had long avoided. The night stretched on, silent and expectant. Somewhere in the darkness, Seraphine moved, free, watching, waiting. And Alaric, for the first time in centuries, felt a flicker of fear, not for his life, but for his soul. Because the woman he had once dismissed as replaceable had returned. And she looked right through him. The castle seemed different at night. Shadows stretched longer than they should, twisting along the walls like dark tendrils. Candles flickered in the great hall, throwing their golden light over tapestries that had seen centuries pass. Alaric walked these halls with the weight of his immortality pressing down, but tonight there was a tension in his step he had not felt in hundreds of years. Seraphine was near, and the knowledge of her presence made the air heavier, as if the walls themselves held their breath. He found her in the library, where ancient tomes towered like sentinels. She was studying a book of old curses, her fingers brushing over the pages with care. Her hair fell across her shoulders, catching the candlelight like strands of molten silver. She did not flinch as he entered, she did not even look up. "You move through my halls as if you own them," he said, his voice low and calm, but carrying the sharp edge of authority. Seraphine finally met his gaze. "I move as one who has the right to see the truth," she replied. Her tone was quiet but steady, her eyes unwavering. "I have learned much since I last stood here. I am no longer the girl you dismissed." Alaric's jaw tightened. She was right. She was stronger, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to him than she had ever been as a girl. And yet he felt an old, stubborn need to assert himself. "Knowledge alone does not protect you here. My realm is not forgiving." "Neither am I," she said, closing the book and setting it carefully on the table. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, and yet filled with an undercurrent of strength that demanded respect. "Do not mistake me for prey." The words struck deeper than any blade. He had ruled through fear, command, and centuries of power, but here was a human, once fragile, now untouchable. She challenged him not with weapons or force, but with her presence, her certainty, her refusal to bend. "You have changed," she said quietly, almost as if noting the shadows that lingered in his eyes. "The king I feared is still here, but there is something else, something I did not expect." Alaric turned away for a moment, staring out the window into the storm-tossed night. "Centuries do that to a soul," he admitted. "Even one like mine cannot escape them entirely." "And yet," she said, stepping closer, "you have not changed enough to understand what you lost when you let me go." The words hung between them like a challenge. He felt the old pulse of desire, regret, and longing, but there was also something unfamiliar: fear. Fear not for his life, but for his control, his kingdom, and the fragile balance between them. He had ruled with absolute certainty for centuries. Now uncertainty lingered, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying. "You speak boldly," he said, turning to face her fully. His eyes, dark and piercing, searched hers as if trying to find a flaw, a crack, a weakness he could exploit. "Do you not remember what you were? Fragile, dependent, afraid." "I remember everything," she said calmly. "And I remember that you told me I was replaceable. That word has never left me, and it has never made me small. You may have thought I was weak, but you were wrong." Alaric's chest tightened. She had always seen him more clearly than anyone else ever could, and now she stood before him, unbroken, untamed, and defiant. He wanted to reach for her, to command her, to reclaim what he thought he had lost, but he could not. She would not allow it. A sudden noise outside the library startled them. The wind rattled the windows, and a low growl echoed through the halls. Alaric's instincts sharpened, and he moved toward the door, his senses alert. Seraphine followed without hesitation. She did not hide, did not plead, did not run. She walked beside him, strong and steady, and the king felt something he had not felt in centuries: respect. Not for power, not for fear, but for courage, for presence, for defiance. They reached the balcony overlooking the cliffs, where the storm raged and waves crashed against jagged rocks far below. Alaric scanned the horizon, his senses stretching beyond human limits. There in the distance a shadow moved, an intruder, a rival vampire who had been watching, waiting for a chance to challenge him. "You are reckless," Alaric said quietly, his eyes on the approaching figure. "This is not your world. You do not belong here." "I belong wherever I choose," Seraphine said, her voice unwavering, "and I choose to be here." The rival emerged from the darkness, tall, imposing, and dripping with malice. "King Alaric," he sneered, "you play with fire. Do you not know the dangers of letting mortals roam freely in your lands?" "I know enough to see the threat," Alaric replied, stepping between Seraphine and the intruder. "And I know enough to see that this human is not mine to command. She is hers, not mine." The rival laughed, a low, cruel sound. "You let her wander here, and now you hesitate. How weak the mighty king has become." Alaric's eyes blazed, his centuries of power coiling like a storm within him. But instead of striking immediately, he turned to Seraphine. "Do you understand what this means? She could be taken, she could be harmed. If I act, there will be consequences." Seraphine met his gaze calmly. "I understand, and if harm comes, I will not beg for mercy. I will face it as I always have, strong, unafraid, and free." Her words stunned him. He had expected fear, negotiation, perhaps even submission. But she stood there, unwavering, and the truth hit him. She was no longer the girl he had once called replaceable. She was equal to any threat, equal to him in ways he could not control and more dangerous than he had imagined. The rival took a step forward, his presence dark and oppressive. Alaric raised his hand, a flicker of shadow magic ready to strike, but he hesitated. Seraphine did not flinch. Her courage, her defiance, her strength, it was a mirror he had never seen before, reflecting his own flaws, his own regrets, and his own humanity. "You cannot protect me," she said softly, almost teasing, almost challenging. "But that is not what I need. I only need to be seen, and you are finally seeing me." Alaric's hand faltered, the shadow magic retreating like a storm held back. He had ruled through fear, through power, through centuries of domination, but none of it mattered here. The only thing that mattered was this human who refused to bend, who refused to be broken, who refused to be replaced. The rival hissed in frustration, sensing the hesitation. He stepped closer, his malice sharpened by impatience. Alaric's instincts screamed for action, yet every fiber of his being was drawn to Seraphine. To protect her, yes, but also to learn, to understand, to respect what she had become. The storm broke in a sudden gust of wind, and lightning flashed, illuminating the three figures on the balcony: Alaric, the vampire king; Seraphine, the human who had defied him; and the rival whose eyes glowed with dark intent. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The night, the castle, the cliffs, and the sea below all held their breath. Then, with a sudden surge, the rival attacked. Shadows twisted and struck, but Seraphine moved with grace, dodging with a fluidity that startled even Alaric. She was not helpless. She was not fragile. She was alive, dangerous, and free. Alaric joined her, his power blending with hers in a strange, unspoken dance. Not to control, not to dominate, but to protect. Together they moved, each step a testament to trust, defiance, and unspoken understanding. The rival faltered, confused by the unexpected partnership between a human and a vampire king. Finally, with a decisive strike, Alaric sent the rival stumbling back into the shadows, vanishing into the night. The wind died down, leaving only the sound of waves crashing below. Seraphine turned to him, her chest rising with quiet strength, her gaze steady. "You see me now," she said simply. Alaric nodded, a rare vulnerability in his expression. "I see you," he admitted, voice low and almost reverent. "And I see myself in ways I do not like." For the first time, the vampire king realized that power was not enough. Strength was not enough. Centuries of rule and fear could not teach him what he had learned tonight: that some bonds are built not on command, but on recognition, respect, and the courage to stand unbroken. Seraphine's eyes searched his, and he felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a long time: hope. Perhaps he could change. Perhaps he could earn her trust. Perhaps he could be more than a king trapped by darkness and pride. But as they turned back toward the castle, the shadows shifted, and a new danger loomed, older, darker, and closer than either of them had realized. The night had not yet finished testing them, and their dance of power had only begun. Alaric's hand brushed hers, not commanding, not claiming, but offering alliance, respect, and acknowledgement. Seraphine took it, her grip firm, her eyes unflinching. Together they would face whatever came next, bound not by fear but by choice. Cliffhanger from the depths of the castle, a low, resonant growl echoed through the halls, a sound older than the kingdom itself. Alaric's eyes narrowed. Something was awakening, something that could destroy everything. And this time he could not face it alone, nor could Seraphine. The true test of their bond, their courage, and their hearts was about to begin. The castle trembled under the weight of a storm that seemed older than time itself. Thunder rolled across the cliffs and waves crashed violently against the jagged rocks below. Lightning illuminated the high towers, casting fleeting light over the ancient stones. Inside, shadows shifted as if alive, carrying whispers from corridors long forgotten. Alaric moved through the halls with a focused intensity, senses sharp, aware that danger was closer than ever. Seraphine walked beside him, silent and composed, yet every step she took carried a quiet confidence. The storm outside mirrored the storm between them, the tension, the longing, the unspoken words that lingered like ghosts. For centuries, Alaric had ruled with power, fear, and command, but none of it mattered now. She was different. She was human, yes, but stronger, braver, and infinitely more dangerous than he had imagined. They reached the grand hall, where a shadow moved like smoke along the walls. Alaric's eyes narrowed. The rival vampire from before had returned, but he was not alone. Behind him, a figure larger and darker emerged, a creature of ancient design, its presence warping the very air. Alaric felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him. This was no ordinary threat. This was the curse he had long tried to ignore, a reminder that even kings are vulnerable. "Stay behind me," Alaric said, though there was no command in his voice. It was a plea, a recognition of her strength and their fragile trust. "I will stay where I choose," Seraphine replied calmly, not stepping back, not faltering. Her gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "But I will not be hidden. I am not afraid." The creature moved closer, its eyes glowing with an ancient hunger. Shadows twisted around it like serpents, and the air thickened with a cold so deep it felt as though it could freeze the soul. Alaric stepped forward, his own power rising to meet the threat, but he felt a strange hesitation. He was not afraid for himself. He was afraid for her, for the woman who had once been replaceable in his eyes, but now held a place in his heart he did not dare name. "Do you truly believe you can face me?" the creature hissed, its voice echoing like rolling thunder. "You are not immortal. You are bound by your own mistakes, and she is merely a human." Alaric's eyes darkened, and a surge of shadow energy burst from his hands, illuminating the hall with a silver-black glow. "She is no mere human," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "She is not fragile and she is not replaceable, and if you think otherwise, you will learn the cost of your arrogance." Seraphine stepped forward, her hands raised but not in fear. She did not wield magic as Alaric did, but her presence radiated strength, courage, and clarity. The creature recoiled slightly, sensing that she was unlike any human it had faced before. "You see me as I am," she said calmly, her voice steady in the storm-filled hall. "I am not weak and I will not be commanded. You will find no victory here." The rival and the creature lunged together, shadows striking like knives. Alaric moved with precision, deflecting and countering, while Seraphine dodged and weaved, using the environment to her advantage. She was not merely surviving, she was participating in the battle, forcing Alaric to recognize her as an equal. As the fight intensified, Alaric saw flashes of her courage that he could not ignore. Every time she moved, every time she stood her ground, it was as if she were teaching him something he had long forgotten. That strength is not just power, it is presence. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. The rival vampire stumbled back, blinded by the combined force of Alaric and Seraphine's defiance. The ancient creature roared, a sound that shook the castle foundations, but Seraphine remained calm, her eyes fixed on Alaric. "You do not have to face this alone," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I am here. I stand with you not because you command it, but because I choose to." Alaric felt a warmth he had not known in centuries. Her choice, her trust, her courage. It was a light in the darkness that had consumed him for so long. And yet, even as the storm raged around them, he knew that the fight was far from over. The curse of his kingdom, the shadows that lingered in every corner, had not been defeated. They had only been confronted, and the true trial was still to come. He moved closer to her, his hand brushing hers, not to control, not to claim, but to offer alliance and acknowledgement. She did not flinch. Their connection was silent yet profound, a bridge between human and vampire, past and present, regret and hope. Suddenly, the creature struck again, faster and more cunning. Alaric blocked it, but the force of the attack sent him sprawling backward. Seraphine acted immediately, pushing him out of the way, her hands steady and sure. "You could have been hurt," he said, his voice a mixture of shock and admiration. "I am not fragile," she replied simply. "Neither am I replaceable. You will learn that if you have not already." Alaric's chest tightened. Every word she spoke, every movement she made, reminded him of the truth he had tried to deny, that love, respect, and trust cannot be demanded, they must be earned. She was teaching him, challenging him, changing him in ways he did not yet understand. With a final, powerful strike, Alaric summoned all his strength, casting the ancient creature back into the shadows from which it had emerged. The rival vampire, sensing defeat, fled into the darkness, leaving the hall silent except for the howling storm outside. Alaric fell to one knee, breathing heavily, the weight of centuries pressing on him. Seraphine stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Her eyes searched his, and in them he saw something he had not expected: understanding, forgiveness, and an unspoken challenge. "You cannot protect me by yourself," she said softly, her voice carrying both warning and care. "And you do not have to. But you can choose to stand with me and face the shadows together." Alaric looked at her, truly looked at her, and realized that she was no longer the girl he had once called replaceable. She was unbroken, fearless, and radiant in her defiance. And for the first time in centuries, he felt something he could not name, a flicker of hope, a glimpse of redemption. The storm outside began to fade, leaving only the sound of distant waves and the whisper of wind through the broken windows. The hall was quiet, but Alaric knew the peace was temporary. The curse of the kingdom, the shadows of the past, and the dangers that lurked in the night would not rest. They would return, stronger and more relentless than before. He rose to his feet, his hand brushing hers again. This time it was not a gesture of command, but of partnership. "We will face it together," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries and the promise of change. Seraphine nodded, her eyes steady and unwavering. "Together," she agreed. As they turned toward the inner corridors of the castle, neither spoke of what had just passed. Words were unnecessary. Their bond had been tested, their courage revealed, and their hearts quietly aligned. They had faced the shadows and survived, not as master and servant, but as allies, equals, and perhaps something more. But even as they walked through the silent halls, the air shifted. A low, resonant growl echoed from the depths of the castle, a sound that vibrated through the stone and chilled the blood. Alaric's eyes narrowed. Something ancient had awakened, something far older and more powerful than either the rival or the creature they had just faced. Seraphine felt it too, the subtle shift in the air, the tension that prickled at her senses. "What is that?" she asked, her voice calm but alert. "I do not yet know," Alaric admitted, his gaze scanning the darkness ahead, "but it is something we cannot face alone." They moved cautiously, each step deliberate, each shadow a potential threat. Alaric's hand remained near hers, not to dominate but to offer reassurance. Seraphine's grip was firm, a silent acknowledgement that she would not falter, that she would not be commanded, that she would stand beside him even in the face of the unknown. The castle seemed to breathe around them, alive with ancient magic and secrets. The walls whispered in languages long forgotten, and the floors creaked with the weight of centuries. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, as if the darkness itself were testing them, probing for weakness. Finally, they reached the inner sanctum, a chamber long sealed and untouched by time. Here, the air was thick with power, and the shadows seemed to move with intent. Alaric stepped forward, sensing the presence that had awakened. Seraphine followed, her eyes scanning every corner, her body poised for anything. Then, in a sudden burst, a figure emerged from the darkness, tall, dark, and impossibly ancient. Its eyes glowed with an inner fire, and its presence radiated power older than Alaric himself. The true test of their bond, their courage, and their hearts had begun. Alaric stepped in front of Seraphine, not to protect, but to face the trial together. The storm within the castle mirrored the storm within him, fear, hope, regret, and desire mingling in a tempest he could no longer deny. Seraphine's hand brushed his again, a silent promise. Whatever awaited them, they would face it together. Not as king and subject, not as master and pawn, but as equals, partners, and perhaps something more profound than either could yet name. Cliffhanger, the ancient figure spoke, its voice like rolling thunder. So, the Vampire King has found a companion worthy of defiance. But will your bond survive the darkness I bring? Alaric's eyes met Seraphine's, and in that silent moment both understood the greatest danger was yet to come, and the cost of failure could be everything. The inner sanctum of the castle was alive with shadows, ancient and heavy, twisting along the walls and ceiling like living creatures. The air smelled of old stone, magic, and centuries of secrets long buried. Lightning flickered outside, briefly illuminating the chamber and casting long, distorted shapes on the floor. In the center stood the ancient figure, its presence radiating power so deep it seemed to warp the very air. Alaric stepped forward, his gaze locked on the figure, but his mind was not on the creature alone. His eyes continually shifted to Seraphine, who stood beside him, calm and poised, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, not as a plea, not as fear, but as a silent declaration. She had chosen to stand with him, and he could no longer deny the depth of his feelings for her. "You have come far," the ancient figure said, its voice like rolling thunder echoing through the vast chamber. "But far is not enough. Darkness does not bend to defiance. It consumes." Alaric's jaw tightened. "Perhaps," he said, his voice low and steady, "but some hearts cannot be consumed. Some bonds cannot be broken by darkness, no matter how ancient or cruel." Seraphine stepped closer to him, her eyes never leaving the figure. "We stand together," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "And if you think we will falter, you are mistaken. We are not weak, we are not alone, and we are not afraid." The ancient figure's eyes glowed brighter, and shadows surged forward, twisting like serpents and crashing toward them. Alaric moved first, summoning shadow energy that spiraled from his hands in dark, sharp streaks. He struck at the approaching darkness, but it was endless, relentless, and for the first time he realized he could not hold it back alone. Seraphine acted beside him, not with magic but with presence. Her movements were precise, fluid, and deliberate. She used the environment, the shadows, the gaps between darkness and light, to her advantage. She did not fight to dominate but to survive, to challenge, and to show Alaric that she was unbreakable. Together, they became a single force, a strange and unspoken partnership. Alaric's centuries of power blended with her courage and clarity, creating a balance that neither had experienced before. Shadows twisted and struck, yet they met every attack with unity, determination, and intelligence. The ancient figure hissed in frustration, sensing that its power could not crush the bond between the two. "You are unusual," it said, its voice trembling with irritation and something else, respect, perhaps fear. "Even centuries of darkness cannot break what is forged in defiance and truth." Alaric glanced at Seraphine, his breath heavy, his chest tight. "You were right," he admitted quietly. "You are not fragile, you are not replaceable, you are remarkable." Seraphine met his gaze, a small, confident smile touching her lips. "And you are more than you know," she said. "But now you must see it for yourself." The ancient figure attacked again, moving faster than before, its shadows sharp and biting. Alaric struggled to contain them, but Seraphine's steady presence reminded him to breathe, to act, to trust. She did not interfere. She did not dominate. She simply stood beside him, fearless and resolute. In that moment, Alaric realized the truth he had long denied. He could not protect her by sheer power, nor could he command her to fear him or obey him. Love, trust, and respect were not things that could be seized. They had to be earned, and they had to be freely given. He met the ancient figure's gaze, and for the first time, he did not feel like a king ruling through fear. He felt like a man standing beside someone he cared for, acknowledging both his flaws and his strengths. Shadow energy spiraled around his hands as he struck, but his focus was not on destruction alone. It was on balance, on protection, on trust. The ancient figure hissed again, the darkness around it swirling violently. "You may survive this night," it said, "but the curse of your kind will follow. You cannot escape it even if you bind a human to your side." Alaric's eyes met Seraphine's, and he felt a warmth in the cold shadows. "We will face it," he said softly, "together. And we will endure no matter what comes." Seraphine's hand brushed against his again, a silent promise, a declaration of unity. "Together," she agreed, "and when it is over, nothing can take away what we have built tonight." The ancient figure roared, the sound shaking the chamber, and surged forward in one final, powerful attack. Shadows struck like lightning, trying to crush everything in their path. Alaric and Seraphine moved in perfect synchrony, their actions instinctive and precise. Alaric used his shadow magic to block and redirect, while Seraphine used her intelligence, her agility, and her courage to anticipate and counter. The combination was overwhelming. Shadows collided, energy surged, and finally, with a synchronized effort, they pushed the ancient figure back. The shadows recoiled, and the figure hissed in defeat, retreating into the darkness from which it had emerged. The hall fell silent except for the echo of their breathing and the faint crackle of fading lightning. Alaric lowered his hands, feeling the exhaustion of centuries pressed into the night, yet there was a lightness he had not felt in forever. Seraphine's presence beside him, steady and unwavering, reminded him that he was not alone. He turned to her, his expression softened by relief and something deeper, admiration, respect, and the quiet stirrings of love. "You stood with me," he said, voice low and reverent. "Not because you had to, but because you chose to. And that choice means more than any power I possess." Seraphine smiled gently, her eyes warm. "And you stood with me, not as a king, not as a master, but as someone who finally sees me for who I am. That is what matters." Alaric reached for her hand, not to claim, not to dominate, but to connect. She took it, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that spoke of equality, trust, and recognition. For the first time in centuries, he felt something that was not born of fear or command, but of mutual respect and understanding. The storm outside had faded, leaving the first light of dawn touching the horizon. Rays of pale gold filtered through the broken windows, illuminating the chamber and casting long shadows behind them. Alaric and Seraphine stood together, bathed in the light, the darkness of the night retreating. "You have changed me," Alaric said softly, almost to himself. "Not with force, not with command, but with everything you are. And I am not sure I can ever go back to what I was." "You should not go back," Seraphine said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. You cannot undo the past, but you can choose what you become. And I will stand beside you not as someone you own, but as someone you respect, trust, and perhaps love." Alaric's chest tightened. Centuries of pride, of solitude, of power built on fear threatened to rise, but he let them fall away. For the first time, he understood that his kingdom, his immortality, and even his power were meaningless without connection, without choice, without the courage to love and be vulnerable. He stepped closer to her, and their faces were inches apart. The world seemed to hold its breath. I do not know what comes next," he admitted, his voice low. "But I know that I want you here beside me, not because I demand it, but because you choose it." Seraphine's eyes softened, and for the first time a smile touched her lips that was more than defiance. It was warmth, hope, and a quiet joy. "Then I am here," she said simply. "Not because you rule, not because you command, but because I choose to be. And I will not be replaceable, not by you, not by anyone, not ever." Alaric felt a shift within himself, something ancient and heavy lifting from his shoulders. The centuries of solitude, of mistakes, of regrets began to feel lighter. He had faced shadows, curses, and ancient powers, but the greatest trial had been learning to see her, and himself, clearly. They stood together in the hall, the dawn casting light over their forms, shadows retreating into the corners. Alaric reached for her hand again, this time as a silent promise of partnership, trust, and perhaps something more enduring than either could yet name. For the first time in his long existence, he realized that power alone was not enough. Strength alone was not enough. Love, trust, respect, and courage were the forces that truly endured. And in Seraphine he had found all of them, mirrored back at him in human form. As they left the hall together, the castle seemed to breathe with them, alive with the promise of change, redemption, and hope. The darkness would return as it always did, but they were ready. Not because they were invincible, but because they were united, fearless, and unbroken. And somewhere in the quiet of the dawn, Alaric whispered almost to himself, "You are not replaceable, and I will never forget it." Seraphine's hand remained in his, her gaze unwavering. "And I never was," she replied. "Now let us face whatever comes next together." The first rays of sun touched the cursed lands for the first time in centuries, and in that light two souls, one mortal, one immortal, stood side by side, bound not by command or fear, but by choice, trust, and a love that had survived shadows older than time itself.